Welcome to Academic, a space for thoughtful conversation between two scholars. No headlines, no sound bites, just an exchange of ideas.
Well, Peter, for our viewers who are not so familiar with these subjects like alchemy, can you explain briefly what alchemy is?
Briefly is tricky. What is History of Alchemy, or what is alchemy? It changes over time. I mean, in antiquity, it's mostly the idea that most people know about making gold, or at least making things look like gold. And then by the time you get to the Middle Ages, when it enters, for example, the Christian West in the 12th century, it's gold making, it's investigating the properties of matter to see what you can do with substances. And slowly over time, it transitions from trying to make gold to other practices. For example, on the practical level, things like fertilizers for agriculture, things like gunpowder for war. But by the time you get to the 15th century, there's an increasing interest in alchemy as medicine, chemical medicine, as a challenge to the classical ways of treating people. That's quite a shock, because it uses poisons, it uses toxins as well, but that becomes increasingly popular in the 16th, 17th century. You also get the question of spiritual alchemy. Historians of science don't have much evidence of that, this idea of alchemy really not being about matter, more about the transmutation or transformation of the human spirit or the human soul. But you do get some indications in the 17th and 18th century that people are thinking, they might be doing laboratory practice, but they're also thinking on other levels as well. And of course, this becomes increasingly popular. In the 19th century, you get the strong ideas of spiritual alchemy. And nowadays, you find the whole spectrum. You find people doing laboratory alchemy, doing things like distillation, making perfumes as a kind of alchemy, but also looking for self-transformation. So it spans the spectrum. And the psychological alchemy, as it were, or psychologization of alchemy you find in Carl Jung and people like that. And I know, I've known you for years, you're a specialist in Rosicrucianism. So could you explain what is meant by Rosicrucianism?
Well, Rosicrucianism, historically, Rosicrucianism was a movement of spiritual renewal and reform, which arose basically in Germany in the early 17th century, at a time when Europe was riven by conflict, which was about to erupt into the 30 Years' War. So it was a very troubled period, and a group of people got together in the Tübingen area of Germany, and they published what were called the Rosicrucian manifestos. These were three documents which set forth a vision for a better future, basically, for European civilization. It was a vision that what we would now call a holistic vision, bringing together religion, science, and the arts, and reaching out to certain ancient traditions of wisdom, including those coming from the Arab world. So that's one way in which this was an unusual sort of movement. What was also unusual about it was that these manifestos were couched in the form of a story, especially the first manifesto, the Fama Fraternitatis, the proclamation or fame or manifesto of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. And it told a story about a man called Christian Rosenkreuz, who, as a young man, went on a journey around the Middle East, gathering the knowledge and wisdom from the wise men of that region. And then he came back to Germany and founded a brotherhood, the Brotherhood of the Rosicross. He then died, and he died at a very advanced age. and was buried in a vault. And the whereabouts of the vault was forgotten until a century or so later, when it was rediscovered by some of the brethren. And in this vault contained, among other things, all kinds of books and manuscripts and scientific equipment of one kind or another, including an object that was described as a minutus mundus, a miniature world. And sometimes I rather flippantly like to suggest that this minutus mundus was in fact a computer connected to the internet. But anyway, this was the story on which the Rosicrucian Brotherhood was founded. Probably it was. It did not literally happen. Probably it was a kind of fable, which was intended to launch a kind of mythology, which would then send out ripples and into the wider culture, which in fact was what happened.
Yeah.
Then came the 30 Years' War, and everything the whole Rosicrucian thing was forgotten for a time. But then there was a sort of Rosicrucian diaspora, and it spread to other countries, including Britain and including Sweden. And as we would say now, it went viral, and there were all kinds of splinter groups and imitation Rosicrucian groups and so on. Which is still the situation today.
I mean, one thing I remember from reading the Fama, because the Fama is 1614, isn't it? That's when it was published.
Yeah.
Was that in the laws, there are a few laws, and the first one, I think it's the first one anyway, is very, very philanthropic. It's this idea that they will treat people medically for free.
Yes.
Which impresses me. And so that leads to a question. We're at a conference connected with the history of alchemy. What kind of alchemy did Rosicrucians practice?
Well, the first manifesto, the Fama, doesn't say a great deal about alchemy, and it's rather downplayed.
Yeah.
There are a few remarks about alchemy, saying sort of disparaging the gold making side of alchemy.
Exactly. Yeah.
But at the same time, saying that alchemy, for example, as a healing system, has a value. But then when you get to the third manifesto, which is called the Chemical Wedding, that is pure. It's more or less pure alchemy. It's a sort of fairy tale in the form of an alchemical allegory.
Yeah.
Really. And then when you get a form of neo-Rosicrucianism, which came towards the end of the 18th century with an order called the Golden Rosy Cross, their alchemy was quite explicitly part of the order. And the initiation rituals to the various degrees involved alchemical symbolism. And the members were expected to have their own laboratories and work diligently at their furnaces and retorts and so on. And I think, unfortunately, some of them blew themselves up in the process. But
because that's where, I mean, the Golden Rosenkreuz, it's where the secret symbols of the Rosicrucians.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
these wonderful manuscripts with full of alchemical and Kabbalistic imagery.
Exactly. Yes.
But I have to ask you, I mean, because I've known you for years now, how did you get into this subject? I mean, Rosicrucianism, but more generally, occult philosophy, esotericism.
Well, I started getting interested in esoteric things when I was a student at Oxford back in the 1960s. And one of the things I got interested in was astrology. And I continued to research into astrology after I left university. And then my first book was a book on astrology. It was called The Astrologers and Their Creed, History of Astrology. And through writing that book, I came into contact with the whole wider range of the Western esoteric traditions. And I became aware of Rosicrucianism as an important current within those traditions. And I also found that there was very little written about it. There was some books by A.E. Waite. But they'd been written back around the 1920s, and I felt that a new book on Rosicrucianism was needed. So then I wrote my book. It was originally called The Rosy Cross Unveiled, later issued as just The Rosicrucians, which was a general history of Rosicrucianism. Yes. So,
but then you wrote the book on the Rosicrucians and the Age of Reason, yeah?
Yes, that was my doctoral thesis, because I then went back to university rather late in life, and did a doctorate in history on the it was published as the Rosicrucians and the Age of Reason, and it was focusing on mainly on the Golden and Rosy Cross order.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The groundbreaking work. I mean, in the English language. I mean, there was nothing available. I mean, it's still read now. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I was lucky enough to come across some very important sources, including handwritten sources, correspondence between various members of the order, and so on. So I was able to give something of an inside view of the order. Maybe I could fire a similar question back at you and ask you how you became interested in this.
How I was doomed. My grandfather, my mum's father, was a follower of the Swedish mystic, Swedenborg. In the north of England, in a little town called Preston, there's a church of Swedenborg. And he was married there. My mother was baptized there. I wasn't, but I remember him telling me about the ideas of Swedenborg when I was a little boy. And also he introduced me to the ideas of Plato and people like that. So I always had an interest. My mum became a psychotherapist, reading a lot of Jung. And so inevitably I mentioned Jung. And that's where I first found alchemy. I was reading, Jung has 3 main books on alchemy. Psychology and Alchemy, for example, is one of them. And I remember looking through those, reading them as a very earnest teenager, for example, Kunrad's Oratory Laboratory is in one of them. And it fascinated me even at the time. But I have to say, when I chose to go to university, nothing was available. So that's why I ended up doing Indology, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Indian philosophy. But years later, it amused me when you said you did your PhD late. I did my PhD late, because I came back to Europe after living in Asia. And after going east, I came west. And I discovered that there was a course in London teaching magic, science and religion on Renaissance studies, MA. And I did that, and I haven't looked back. And it's so alchemy has always been fascinating. That whole all the ideas of transformation, change. Astrology is the basis for it. I taught myself astrology as a teenager with this stupid idea it would help me pick up girls. And instead, girls came to me to talk about their boyfriends. So in the end, yes, that was a total disaster as a life choice, but it informed me anyway in other ideas. And then, the history of magic. I mean, you're English. I grew up with stories of King Arthur and Merlin. So there was a natural gravitation towards, so what is the reality of magic? What kinds of magic were practiced? Just like what kinds of alchemy were practiced. And ever since, I've been interested in what I call these hybrids, people who are, for example, alchemists, but also who look left and right to different mystical traditions to try and get inspiration and to try and find explanations for things which are really difficult to understand and pass on, And so that's how I got hooked.
Yes.
And how I stayed in. Do you, I mean, over the centuries, there have been many famous figures, but which ones were particularly influential for the Rosicrucians? I'm thinking Paracelsus.
Oh, yes.
It's rather anachronistic that he's mentioned they find a book in the vault, but it's sort of temporary. Time-wise, it's impossible that he could be there. But nevertheless, Paracelsus, who's, for those who don't know, Paracelsus is famous for being a medical reformer, for advocating the use of chemical medicines, much to the horror of the universities at the time, who were using the classical ideas from antiquity of Galen and Hippocrates. But it's interesting, I find it very fascinating that the Rosicrucians, who now to modernity sounds like an old group, but at the time they were cutting edge. They were a new appearance on the scene, and they were advocating the ideas of Paracelsus.
Yes,
which is fascinating.
Yeah, well, one of the key ideas of Paracelsus was the idea of the two lights, namely the light of nature and the light of the scriptures.
Yeah.
So that if you wanted to commune with the divine, there were two ways you could do that. You could either go to the scriptures, or you could go to nature and read the book of nature, as he said.
Yeah.
So this is one of the key ideas of the Rosicrucian movement. In fact, it was a very important moment in history, because if society had gone down the Rosicrucian, had continued to go down the Rosicrucian road, then we would have a very different type of science today, and a different type of culture in many different ways. So this idea of the two, the book of nature and the book of the scriptures, was rejected by mainstream Christianity. And there was a famous dispute between the English Rosicrucian Robert Flood, Robert Flood, and a French monk, Maramasen.
Yeah.
Yes, and basically Flood represented the Rosicrucian point of view that all of nature is sacred, and so by reading the book of nature you can put yourself in touch with the divine. And Mersenne said, no, this is mixing religion and science.
Yeah.
He said, religion is religion, science is science. They each have a role, but they shouldn't be mixed.
Yeah.
Well, the Maramasen's point of view, in fact, triumphed. And so you had this separation. So, and then came the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And so the spiritual was taken out of nature, and then religion declined, and so you were left with a completely sort of godless and spiritless world. So that Rosicrucian moment was very important. It was in a way an opportunity was lost at that moment.
And I suppose also, Mersenne was a minim friar, he was Catholic, whereas the Rosicrucians are distinctly not Catholic, they're very anti-Jesuit, particularly. So there's also a clash of religious worldviews, that's Protestants versus Catholic. And also Mersenne, I do remember reading, Mersenne and various others were very worried about how alchemists would discuss the book of Genesis, the moment of creation. And of course, alchemy is very much about creating things. But they discuss it as God working in a laboratory. And Mersenne was extremely worried about that, because it's reducing the divine act of creation, the mysterium, reducing it to laboratory practice. And he was extremely anxious about that. He criticized the guy I focus on way too much, Heinrich Kunrat of Leipzig, who has this idea. Robert Flood defends Kunrat and himself against Mersenne's ideology, really, and against these critiques that they are I suppose they are elevating the status of alchemy, and Mersenne gets very anxious about this because it's true, it's blurring boundaries. Confession and profession become mixed in a way that they don't find, that Mersenne does not like. But it's interesting, actually, he's very critical of alchemy, and then he discovers that his friend Descartes is doing alchemical experiments, so he changes his tune. I think, oh well, maybe there is something in it after all. But he's nevertheless worried about this explaining creation as an alchemical process, which I find fascinating. Yes. Yeah, and the anxieties that come about because of that. And it's Robert Boyle. I mean, Robert Boyle talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, but again, in a very sort of alchemical way as well. This idea in alchemy where if you're heating something in an alchemical vessel, something evaporates, a spirit that rises up in the flask. It's not spiritual in a mystical sense. It's just, if you boil water, you get steam. It evaporates. But that's represented by a bird, usually in alchemy. It's volatile, so it's flying upwards. And of course, the Holy Spirit is represented by a dove as well. So Flood is making these analogies, but it really worries more orthodox conventional thinkers because, again, it's blurring boundaries.
And there was a very interesting school of thought in Silesia where you had a group of mystical poets, like mystical poets and philosophers, like Jacob Boehme, for example, and there was one called Daniel Chepko. And one of the ideas that they had was that the Trinity, the Christian Trinity, is actually present in matter in the form of three alchemical principles or modalities, namely salt, sulfur, and mercury. So the divine is literally present in matter.
I think that's, it's very Paracelsian. Paracelsus takes the Middle Ages, the medieval period, and earlier really, had this idea that to make the Philosopher's Stone, what the Philosopher's Stone is debatable, but it's the idea that you create something. Originally they said use mercury and use sulfur. Use watery female mercury and fiery male sulfur. You combine them together in perfect proportions and you get the Philosopher's Stone. And on the most basic level, they believe that's for transmuting base metals like lead and tin and copper and so forth into noble metals like silver or gold, which really worried aristocracy, particularly kings, because you debase the coinage if you could succeed in doing that. Though Queen Elizabeth, who never had enough money, was very interested. She had an alchemist working for her, as did many aristocrats. But Paracelsus takes this binary, mercury and sulfur, and adds salt, partly because he's a physician and salt is really important in medical contexts, but also because he was not happy with the pagan binary of mercury and sulfur that had been inherited and wanted a Trinitarian system. He was born Catholic and remained Catholic and till he died. And so yes, that Trinitarian mercury, sulfur and salt was very important to him. Even though, people listening probably think, why are these three substances? Sometimes they were literally working with these substances or purified versions of them, but also Paracelsus gives this really nice idea that they are modalities of matter. He said, if you take a piece of wood and you burn it, and basically the ash that remains is the salt, the fire that comes is sulfur, and the smoke is the mercury that evaporates away. And so it's less a literal elemental substance and more a mode of matter, which is interesting, again, fascinating, and curious how different people have interpreted these in different ways. There's not been one consistent, systematic interpretation through history. People's ideas differ.
Right. But what's also interesting is the way that alchemy has developed into modern times. And again, the Rosicrucian movement played a part in this because in German, in the German-speaking world, the tradition of the Golden Rosenkreuz, Golden and Rosy Cross, continued, and the Golden and Rosy Cross gave rise to various offshoots. One current from the Golden and Rosy Cross flowed into modern movements like Amok, and out of Amok came Paracelsus College, which was founded by a German, Albert Riedel, and so that whole alchemical tradition was continued, and through Paracelsus College, many people learned practical alchemy. So it's still going today.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, if you Google Spurics, which is a Paracelsian term, isn't it?
Yes.
Spurics is allegedly from Greek words to break things down and then join them back together again after you've removed all of the stuff you don't want, the impurities. And you get a lot of people, I don't know anyone who's doing Spurics actually with metals, but that's just my circles aren't big enough. But certainly with distillation of plant material, that's definitely the case. You can get distillation equipment easily, relatively easily. And it's true, it's like doing lavender, or rose water and things like that, and essential oils. That's I've done that. That's the sort of basic type of Spurics. That's alive and kicking. I mean, what I like is the sort of very broad spectrum now that you've got people doing laboratory, sort of what I call the sort of hard, alchemy. They're doing laboratory work, and then others are on the other side of the spectrum. They're looking at things psychologically. Now, as a historian, Jungian readings horrify me because they're not historically accurate. But at the same time, if you say that there is a 20th and 21st century alchemy, where alchemy modifies, evolves, if you want to say that, or at least transforms, then and I know Jungian therapists who find it very useful as a language to use with their clients.
Yes.
And to discuss trauma and change and things like that. Because alchemy begins. I mean, some of the earliest record we have of an alchemist by name is Zosimus of Panopolis, around 300 CE of the Common Era. And it's famous that he records his alchemy, particularly through these visions, these horrific dreams. And so even though historians of science will interpret this as real laboratory techniques which are couched in the language of dreams, nevertheless it opens up the subject to people who are really dealing with people who are having dreams and nightmares and so forth, as a way of engaging with the subject as well. And I have to say, I like all of them. I can't use Jung in my period in the 16th century because it's anachronistic. It's the readings, you can't psychologize it there. Well, you can, but then you're no longer a historian. But I do like this modern spectrum where you've got... And I had an amazing student who did research on people who were making alchemical tinctures and things like this, and were at the same time having dreams. And this student is a therapist, so they were recording what dreams they were having while they were doing these long alchemical processes over months. That's a nice combination of theory and practice,
Yes, but I think it would be a mistake to concentrate too much on the Jungian sort of approach.
I agree.
Because it's very much a dual process. And you can see that in that famous engraving of Kunrad's of the amphitheatrum.
Oh, yeah, the oratory laboratory.
The oratory laboratory, yes, where there's a whole lot of alchemical equipment. And in the corner, there's a man who's praying at an altar.
Yeah, very much.
And that was very much the case with the Golden and Rosy Cross. It was very much a dual process.
Yeah, and Heinrich Kunrad is an interesting example of someone who's born in 1560, dies in 1605. His best-known work is this Amphitheatre of Eternal Wisdom. It's not his most alchemical work, but he is mostly known as an alchemist. But the Amphitheatre of Eternal Wisdom I find fascinating because it's got quite a lot of engravings. And he's engaging with various subjects. He's engaging with Christian Kabbalah, so the Jewish idea of Kabbalah, but he's Christianized it, as people had done in the 15th century. He's dealing with magic, natural magic and supernatural magic, but he's also dealing with alchemy. And most people say, oh, he must be dealing with spiritual alchemy. No, he says he's dealing with physico-chemistry, laboratory chemistry, as in his famous engraving of the, well, famous, but well-known engraving of the Oratory Laboratory. He's a doctor. He trained in Leipzig and then in Basel, the same place where Paracelsus taught decades earlier. And he's interested in different types of alchemy. He's interested in gold making. He's interested definitely in chemical medicines, without doubt. But he's also, as far as I'm concerned, the first person who talks about the purgation and purification of his body, spirit, and soul on a religious level, but he's using alchemical language to discuss it. Now, I don't know whether that says he's being a spiritual alchemist, because it's very poorly defined, but he's certainly, it's alchemical spirituality, at least. He's using alchemical language to talk. There's a diagram where you've got the 4 elements, and he begins by purifying the earth of his body, as it were, the most sort of physical bits, and then he moves to water and dissolving in the tears of penance. So he's using Christian language there as well, in a sort of alchemical context. And then he moves to air, because you're moving up through the elements, and air is spiritualizing things. And then he ends with fire. And what I find fascinating is he invents a word. He talks about the alchemist as being fiery-minded Adam. Now, Adam is clearly Adam of Adam and Eve, where when they ate the apple, mankind fell, but so did nature. So this idea that his alchemy is actually a redemption of the human soul, but also the redemption of nature as well, which is quite fascinating. It brings in other dimensions. But this fiery-minded is mentigneus, the word is in Latin, which he just makes up. And it's quite fascinating because it's the highest element in the tradition of the 4 elements. It's the closest one to the divine. So this whole idea is that just as in alchemy, you're seeking to purify substances. For example, you can't use just a simple poison. You kill people. So you purify it. You try and rid it of the most dangerous things. So with ourselves, we purify ourselves. Now, he's not very explicit about this. It's one picture. And he just leaves it to the reader to try and interpret what's going on. But this picture is very interesting because if you look very carefully, it's surrounded by these ladders of 10 stages. One is the ladder of union with God. So clearly the idea that you rise from the earth up to the heavens and the divine. And the other one is grades of the soul from Aristotle, oddly. Given the fact that Kunrath is a follower of Paracelsus, and Paracelsus was aggressively against Aristotle, it's interesting to see that Kunrath, who's been to university and trained in Aristotle as well, begins with how you perceive things. You begin with the external object. You know, it's like, I'm looking at you, Chris, now, you're the external object. The image of you is going through the air into my eyes, and then slowly that image is absorbed in my imagination, and so forth. And then it's worked on by 3 different levels of consciousness. Reason, which is the everyday lowest level of consciousness, like we're using now, I hope. And then intellect, which is a higher level and sort of more intuitive. And then mens, or mind, which is the highest level. And some philosophers said, well, is that really us or is that God? It's so high. But this is what I'd like to tell my students, that when you're talking about people like Kunrath, or talking about people like Robert Flood, who again is a physician, and they've trained in, you know, old ideas of cognition, about understanding things through the soul and so forth, you can't just have a simplistic reading and simple answers to anything. That alchemy and all the other practices often become a hybrid, that they're mixed. Flood is amazing for that. I mean, you know well, I mean, those wonderful books of Flood, which are absolutely full of diagrams. And he's interested in mechanics, he's interested in military warfare, he's interested in alchemy, he's interested really in Kabbalah. So he's encyclopedic in his interests. He's got fingers in so many pies. And that's what I find fascinating about the history of alchemy, that we're often dealing with polymaths. We're dealing with people who, you know, they're fascinated in bringing connections to so many different levels of existence.
Yes, I often think that period in the 17th century was the last period when it was really possible to be a polymath. Yes, when you think of somebody like Flood, or for that matter, Isaac Newton, who was really, I think, almost the last great scientist who was also a hermetist.
And that he wrote, I mean, we know Newton wrote far more about religion than he wrote about science.
Yes, that's right.
But he didn't publish it because, and he had so many notes about alchemy. And what's interesting is that historians of science in the past would say, oh, people like Boyle and Newton, they're not interested in alchemy. They transcend it. They just leave it behind. It's dross. It's rubbish. And then you go and read manuscripts of Newton, and he's reading avidly the works of Michael Meyer, one of the guys I study, who has that beautiful emblem book of 50 beautiful engravings and 50 pieces of music. And people just dismiss that as, oh, that's nonsense. But that was Michael Meyer, who was the personal physician to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, one of the two most powerful men in the world at the time, and was an alchemist. And Newton is taking him seriously, and he's reading, and you can see he's writing down the names of various books, including the picture book, to find alchemical secrets in it. So I like that in the last sort of 20, 30 years, we're sort of changing our attitudes. We're looking at people and sort of trying to look at them sympathetically in the context of their time, instead of saying they're not 21st century people, which is a silly attitude anyway. And I mean, another person it makes me think of, Athanasius Kircher.
Oh, yes.
You know, who's being classed as the last man who knew everything. Because imagine you're sort of trying to read every publication that's coming out and to make sense of it and to become an authority in it. But of course, we can't do that now. We specialize. You know, and
as you say, it's good that this reassessment is going on, because as you say, the whole esoteric side of Newton was missed by scientific historians for a long time because it didn't fit the paradigm. But as you say, that's now changing. I think somebody like Francis Yates played a big role in changing that paradigm.
She made it licit to study this.
She did. That was a big breakthrough with her works like Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment.
That came out the year I was born. So old now.
Yes.
Chris, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I mean, you and I taught, was it 15, 20 years ago together in Exeter?
Yes.
And it's sad to say I've not seen you much since, so it's great to catch up. And also very nice to learn the background to your interests. It's always fascinating to hear how scholars got into the subject area. But thanks also for sharing ideas about the Rosicrucians and their alchemy.
It's also been a great pleasure for me to meet with you again. So I hope that we won't leave it another 15 years or so before we meet again.
Won't be around by then, probably, but
I hope you will.
Thanks, pleasure.